Hey guys, SGT here. Thanks so much for tuning in, this time with the one and only Michael Snyder from the Economic Collapse blog and endoftheamericandream.com. Michael, thanks so much for taking the time.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, you know what? We have been posting your work religiously from day one, and I never miss an article. In fact, your articles, you post one every day over at Economic Collapse blog, and it's always my favorite read of the day. There's just something about the way you write and deliver the information, even though it's usually scary, bad information, that makes your articles really compelling and fun to read.
Well, thank you for saying that. And all of us have a way that we can contribute to trying to wake the American people up. And personally, myself, I was, a few years ago, I was working kind of in the belly of the beast, right there in the heart of Washington, D.C. I was working as a low-level attorney at a Washington, D.C. law firm, and I was distressed about the corruption I was seeing around me and the direction this country was headed. So I thought, well, what can I do? So I started writing. And at first, very few people took note of what I was doing, but it eventually started to grow over time. And then I started the Economic Collapse blog, and it really struck a chord because I think, most Americans, millions of Americans were losing their jobs, millions of Americans were losing their homes, and people knew they weren't getting the truth about the economy from the mainstream media, and they wanted some answers. And so what I've done with my site is I've tried to take a different approach than most people who write about economics. Most people who write about economics seem like they're trying to impress someone and they write way up in the clouds where nobody can understand. But what I try to do is write for the man on the street, where hopefully people can understand. I use lots of charts and graphs and lists, and I try to write in such a way that not only can people understand, but they can share with their family and friends and say, hey, check this article out. This explains such and such. And so, the site has become very popular as throughout the alternative media. We've seen an explosion in popularity as people are seeking out alternative sources of truth, because the mainstream media, 90% of what you see on the television is controlled at the top by just 6 giant corporations.
That's right.
So they've almost got a monopoly on things. That's why people are looking for alternative sources now. Yeah,
and the point we have always made is that it's the Mockingbird news media that I take exception to. That's the problem I've got. That's why I started SGT Report. It was my effort to contribute to this truth movement. I mean, really, Orwell said in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act, and all we're trying to do is combat that, what I call corporate propaganda. You mentioned those 6 or 7 major corporations that disseminate 90% of the news Americans get. I want to combat that. I want to combat that with truthful, alternative media news sources like your own. Let's talk about the big picture. Zero Hedge just reported the other day that 80% of U.S. adults are near poverty, rely on welfare, or are unemployed. Is this the America that you thought it would be when you were growing up as a kid, Michael?
No, not at all. When I was growing up as a kid, it seemed like almost everyone was middle class. It seemed like almost everyone had a job in terms of the adults. It seemed like everyone was doing pretty good, could take care of their families. But we're seeing a fundamental change now in our economy. We've seen millions of jobs shipped out of the country since 2001. We've seen more than 56,000 manufacturing facilities permanently shut down. Once upon a time, the city of Detroit actually had the highest per capita income in the entire country. Now today, Detroit is gone bankrupt, and poverty is everywhere. In fact, in the city of Detroit today, 60% of all children are living in poverty. So we're seeing this fundamental shift, but the mainstream media keeps telling us, oh, things are getting better. The stock market is all-time record high. The U.S. economy is improving. And even take the jobs number from last month. They said, 195,000 jobs added to the economy. But what the American people didn't hear is that the U.S. economy actually lost 240,000 full-time jobs last month, and since the peak of that we saw back in 2007, the U.S. economy is still about 6 million full-time jobs below where we were at back in 2007. And so what we've seen is a shift away from good-paying full-time jobs to part-time and temp jobs. In fact, today, in the United States today, the number 1 employer is Walmart. The number 2 employer is actually a temp agency. Kelly Services is actually the number 2 employer in the country today.
Oh, I didn't know that. That is amazing. I had no idea.
Oh, yeah, and so we're seeing the American people today, the husband and the wife both have to work, sometimes more than one job. We've got 53, according to the Social Security Administration, 53% of all American workers make $30,000 a year or less. So, a lot of families are really struggling to make it in this environment.
Yeah, and it takes two incomes to replicate that income. The prototypical income we saw in the Leave It to Beaver days, right, where Hugh Downs, Beaver's dad, went off to work and Mom stayed home. I suppose the salary he was making at that time was probably equivalent to, $80,000 today. And, a lot of folks, even with a husband and a wife working, can't even bring in that income. And when we look at Detroit, which you mentioned moments ago, I think that's the model for what's to come, because now that we're seeing a judge throw out any challenges to the bankruptcy being declared in Detroit, which is going to allow the pensioners and everybody else, with the exception of the big banks, to be thrown under the bus. If that is allowed to go forward, that model will be used by Chicago. We're already seeing that in the news. And it'll be used by other big cities throughout the nation, won't it? I mean, isn't this the model moving forward, what we're seeing in Detroit, Michael?
Oh, it absolutely is. What's happening in Detroit now is going to really set a precedent for what's coming, because all over the country, state and local governments, they're drowning in debt, but not only debt, but future unfunded liabilities. They've made huge promises to retirees, to people who are expecting the pension to be there at the end of the rainbow, but there's no way in the world that many of these cities and state governments are going to be able to keep these promises. And so we're seeing this in Detroit, where people, they worked for decades and hung in there at the same job for decades because they thought, well, when I retire, I've got a great pension waiting for me. Now they're finding out, it's going to be taken away. Maybe they'll get pennies on the dollar. There's been talk that it might be, 10 cents on the dollar. And so there's going to be a lot of people which are going to be, they're in retirement years now, reaching retirement years, they're going to be utterly destitute. But this is going to start happening all over the country, because we can't keep all these promises that we made to the baby boomers. There's no way. And on a national level, we're rapidly heading toward that point as well, with Social Security and Medicare, and the money's just not going to be there. And so, we're rapidly approaching a retirement crisis, which is going to be really unprecedented in this country.
When we talk about the death of the middle class, I really don't think that there is a better case study than Detroit to look at. As we see with NAFTA and globalization, we see the outsourcing of American jobs and manufacturing to China and other nations, as we see the gutting of these formerly glistening cities, it's just really, really disturbing, because there doesn't seem to be a way out unless we start to get the manufacturing back. So it just really scares me, what we're up against as we see these inner cities literally collapse from within.
Yeah, and once upon a time, Detroit was an example to the rest of the world of American industry and of the American middle class. And back in 1950, there were about 296,000 manufacturing jobs in Detroit. Today, there are less than 27,000, so it's gone down by about 90%. And you go into Detroit today, there are approximately 78,000 abandoned buildings. It's kind of as you mentioned, just frightening to drive through the city. But it's not only that it's been abandoned, but that the standard of living and the population is in decline. In terms of, there are 47% of the residents of the city of Detroit that are functionally illiterate. They can't read. As I mentioned earlier, you've got 60% of the children in the city living in poverty. And in fact, one of the major sources of tax revenue in the city of Detroit today is from the casinos. It's not from the auto industry or some of the other things. It's from the casinos. But this is an example of a great American city that's dying. Today, 40% of the streetlights don't work. About a third of the ambulances aren't running. It's a complete and total mess. And meanwhile, the crime has risen so high and things have got so dangerous that even the police are telling people to enter Detroit at your own risk. risk. The police were actually handing out flyers at one point that actually said that right on the flyer.
Yeah, it's just really troubling, Michael. And, let me ask you this. With what we're seeing in Detroit, we're going to see the people thrown under the bus, and we're going to see the banks, the big banks, bailed out. Banks like Goldman, banks like Deutsche Bank. We're going to see the big banks bailed out 75, 80 cents on the dollar. Do you think that the average person in this country has any idea what the power is of these big banks? I mean, you write about it in one of your recent articles here, Who Controls the Global Economy? Don't underestimate the power of the big banks. Do you think the average American has any idea what they're up against here?
No, I think the American people really underestimate just the immense power. They'll hear something about Goldman Sachs or J.P. Morgan, and they know they're powerful, but really these banks and major financial institutions are really at the heart of the global economic system. These banks and major financial institutions are really at the heart of the global economic system. For example, there was a team of researchers in Switzerland at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and they examined the relationships between 37 million companies and investors worldwide. And what they found was that at the very core of it, there was what they called a super entity of just 147 very tightly knit companies that controlled 40% of the entire network. And then when you looked at the top 50 of these companies in this super entity that control basically the global economy, almost every single one is either a bank or a financial institution. So they really are the core of everything. And so when people talk about bringing down the big banks and getting rid of the big banks, well, it's kind of like a cancer. I mean, a patient with a very advanced a case of cancer. Sometimes if you kill the cancer, you kill the patient. It's kind of the case with us. If you got rid of the big banks, if you killed the big banks, you would kill the whole system, because our system today runs on credit and debt. We use debt for everything, to buy a home, to buy a car, to go to college, whatever we do, to start a business, to order products, to pay our employees. The flow of credit is absolutely essential in our system today. That's why they're called too big to fail, because the politicians and the people running things know if the big banks fail, the whole system's going under.
Well, that's right, Michael. And what it leaves us with is essentially a Sophie's choice, right? This choice of allowing the status quo just to continue, or trying to put an end to all this criminality and bringing this nightmarish Ponzi scheme down on our own heads, which may leave Americans penniless. It may lead to massive hyperinflation. Things could get a whole lot worse. And we've been talking a lot about the need for the immediate restoration of Glass-Steagall to retie down these banks and to prevent them from dealing in more derivatives fraud in these major cities like they did in Detroit, and as they've done with Cyprus and Greece. We need to prevent that, or they're going to bring down this entire country by design. What is your take on Glass-Steagall? Do you think it's too little too late, or is that one practical step that we can actually do to try to turn this thing around to some degree?
Well, I think it would be a good step in the right direction. And you mentioned derivatives. I think that's the biggest danger, because the American people don't realize that every single day these major banks are basically walking a high wire act, and normally things work out fine and everything's great. But one false step and we could be looking at utter disaster. When you're talking about derivatives, the notional value of the total amount of derivatives in the world today is it's been estimated to be more than $1 quadrillion. And you look at some of these banks, for example, Goldman Sachs has total assets of about $114 billion, but they've got total exposure to derivatives of more than $41 trillion. In other words, the exposure that Goldman Sachs has to derivatives is more than 362 times greater than their total assets. So they're taking immense, incredible risks. And the biggest chunk of these derivatives contracts, and when I talk about derivatives, people think, well, that sounds complicated. I'm going to kind of tune out. But derivatives, it's kind of like if you go to Las Vegas and you make a bet on whether your favorite football team is going to win the Super Bowl this year or not. At the heart of it, that's what derivatives really are. It's not investing in anything real, but it's basically betting on what's going to happen. And the biggest chunk of it is interest rate derivatives, betting on what the future direction of interest rates. And today there are approximately $441 trillion worth of interest rate derivatives sitting out there. And these big banks, they've written all these derivatives contracts assuming that interest rates will stay low and they're not going to have to pay them off, and that they're going to make a profit on these bets that they've made, these contracts they've made with people. But if interest rates start to rise dramatically, and they have started to rise, the long-term interest rates, all of a sudden you could see just a wave of problems much greater than you saw back in 2008. But this is the kind of situation these big banks such as J.P. Morgan Chase, Citibank, Bank of America, Goldman are facing, where they've got this huge exposure to interest rate derivatives and we've seen the yield on 10-year U.S. Treasuries. I looked at it just a little bit earlier. It's up to 2.6%. Has gone up dramatically just over the last couple of months. But if you look at the longer-term trends, it's got a huge way to go back up just to get back to kind of normal levels. And so if we see interest rates go up, not only could we see major problems with interest rate derivatives, but mortgage rates have already started to go up. That could freeze up the real estate market, cause another housing crash. Rising interest rates would cause junk bonds and corporate bonds to drop in value tremendously. In fact, CNBC is talking about investors could lose trillions of dollars. And then, of course, state and local governments would have to pay much more to borrow money, and the federal government as well would have to pay more to borrow money.
Well, Michael, in this brief time we have left together here, I wanted to ask you your opinion on precious metals in physical form, because we talk about how powerful the banks are. And, in the circles you and I run in, we talk a lot about the manipulation of the prices of the precious metals through the paper markets, the paper fraud. We know that the banks collude to set rates in the LIBOR scandal. We know that the collusion happens. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy fact. As it relates to the prices of precious metals and even the thesis of trying to own physical precious metals to protect ourselves in whatever's coming next. Where do you stand on that? What's your take on owning physical precious metals in this environment? Because we do see central banks hoarding those metals. We do see central banks and nation states like China acquiring the metals in physical form. So regardless of what Americans choose to do, the rest of the world seems to be acquiring the metals.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we're seeing China import record amounts of gold right now, and there are persistent rumors that they plan to go to a gold-backed currency at some point. But we're seeing enormous amounts of gold going into China, and we're starting to see shortages of physical gold and silver start to emerge all over the world. So I'm actually a huge fan of gold and silver. I believe over the long term it's a fantastic long-term investment. Now, in the short term, I try to warn people about wild fluctuations in price, and we've started to see that. I believe we will continue to see that. There will be wild swings in the prices of gold and silver, but if you are in it for the long term, because I believe that we're rapidly headed for another major financial crisis, stock market crash, all of that, and it's going to be horrible. But in the aftermath of that, I believe that the response by the government, by the Federal Reserve, we're going to see an influx of bailouts and money printing and government debt, and just as they try to revive the system like we've never seen before. And I believe that's the point when we're going to see the dollar collapse. We're going to see inflation like we've never seen before. And I believe eventually we're going to see gold go to unprecedented heights, but I particularly love silver, because silver comes out of the ground. Some people say at a 9-to-1 ratio to gold, others say 10-to-1, 12-to-1. But right now, the ratio of the gold price to the silver price is about 65-to-1. So right now, even in comparison to gold, I believe silver is massively undervalued. Plus, silver is constantly being used up in thousands of consumer products, our smartphones, solar panels, et cetera, et cetera. So silver is constantly being used up, unlike gold. So in particular, I love silver for the long term. I believe it's going up into the triple digits eventually. And right now it's so low, I believe this is a historically good buying opportunity.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's a great opportunity, especially for anybody new at this point, because they dodged the bullet on not buying in the 40s, and here they get to buy back in the 20s, which we know is a manipulated paper price. And with all the shenanigans going on in the COMEX, it just leads one to believe that this story is far from over. Michael, it sure was a joy to speak with you. I thank you for your time, and I thank you for your contributions to truth on a daily basis. Can you just remind people of how to find your two great sites out there on the Internet?
Sure. The primary website I'm known for is the economiccollapseblog.com, or if you just go to Google and type in the economic collapse, it'll be the first result that comes up. Or my articles can also be found at endoftheamericandream.com, and I've just recently released a new novel entitled The Beginning of the End, which is set in the near future in the United States, in which I've tried to communicate a lot of things I've learned and written about, but it's in a fictional format. It's called The Beginning of the End, and you can find it on Amazon.com.
Well, great. Maybe we can have you back in the future here, Michael, and we can talk about your book. Would that be all right?
Oh, absolutely. I'd be glad to come back anytime.
Okay. Well, we really appreciate it. And just a word to everybody who's listening. I just want you to know that people like Michael, people in this movement who are out there really trying to help inform the American public and who are actively trying to help take our republic back through whatever means. I just want you all to know that we really very much appreciate your support, and I really do believe we're all in this mess together, and we can either stand together or we surely will all hang separately. And I don't want to be in a Bankster noose, and I know none of you want to be in a Bankster noose either. So thanks for standing with us. Thanks for visiting sgtreport.com and Economic Collapse blog. Michael, thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
All right, guys. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.